Hello and welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast. In this episode, we bring you an interview with James York and Jonathan deHaan. James York is a lecturer at Tokyo Denki University, and Jonathan deHaan is Associate Professor at the University of Shizuoka. James and Jonathan specialise in games-based language teaching and are co-founders and editors of the journal Ludic Language Pedagogy. In this interview, Matthew asked them some questions about their teaching and research. We hope you enjoy the interview.
I'm talking here with James York and Jonathan deHaan. First of all, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Pleasure. Thank you for inviting us.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you. So just to start very briefly, could I ask the two of you, maybe separately, just to give a very brief introduction in terms of who you are and maybe a little, brief history of your career in language teaching,
Okay.
where you came from, where you are now, etc. And maybe James, you can start.
Sure. My career in language teaching, I'm from the UK and I did a undergraduate degree in music technology. And after I finished, I was looking for a job, couldn't really find anything in my field, and decided to come over to Japan as an ALT, which is quite a common story for a lot of people that end up as language teachers here. I came over as an ALT, worked 4 years in elementary school. During that time, I got a master's in applied linguistics and TEFL. And then I started working at a university, which I'm currently at now, the same one, which is Tokyo Denki University. And during my time at Tokyo Denki University, I realized that I needed a research direction or something to output academic papers on. And that's when I realized that a lot of my language learning happened around the use of games. So I decided to use games as a focus of my research, trying to include them into my practice and any kind of academic papers that I was writing. And during that time, I got a PhD using Minecraft as an environment for teaching languages. So that's my brief background.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Jonathan?
Yeah, so my undergrad is in English literature and linguistics. And at that time, I started volunteering to teach English to immigrant children in the US. And it was just an invitation from a professor. And I just sort of fell in love with it. Like getting the opportunity to prepare to help someone learn something that they really needed to learn was just amazing. Like I felt like my brain was sort of just being, turned around in my skull, like thinking about language in a new way, thinking about teaching in society in a new way. So I did that as an undergrad. I taught in Japan for a year or so, wanted to learn more. So I did a MAT Sol, where I started exploring games a little bit and started doing some research there. I got a job at a university in Japan, worked there for a while, wanted to learn even more. So I went back to the States and got a PhD in educational technology, which seemed like the best fit to look at just the potential for games. It wasn't really a language-focused program. It was much more ed psych, pedagogy, technology, and game design. And then I've been a professor in Japan for about 12 years, just looking at games and language learning. Like that's my main area of research, very broadly, whether it's computer games, role-playing games, simulations, play, and language learning. So that's who I am.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Now, could you talk a little bit about how the two of you work together?
When I was originally trying to come up with a research agenda, I was scouring the internet for other teachers that were doing things with games and language learning and language teaching. And Jonathan's name came up a few times. And I realized that he was based in Japan. And I think it was happenstance. I don't think it was intentional, but we met at a conference back in, I want to say 2014. And we just hit it off. And I was very, very starstruck at the time because he was one of the few teachers that were being cited for his work on the use of games in teaching. So I was like, oh, wow, it's deHaan sensei. And then we got together and we've been collaborating and been growing ever since.
Absolutely. Yeah, and James and I work together on this journal, of course, and we play games and we talk about games and language teaching. We work together in a way that I think we just like sort of bounce questions off each other, right? Like we both are interested in improving our teaching in our own contexts, and meeting each other, we sort of just found like each other to be kindred spirits in that we want to ask these questions and we want to figure out things out for our own contexts. And so we bounce ideas off each other. We ask questions about games and how they fit into language teaching and how it fits into different teaching approaches. and we sort of are just diving deep on games and language teaching, which led to the creation of the journal and websites and Slack conversations and forum posts and recruiting people and things like that. That's the sort of ways that we work together.
Okay, great. Before we get into some of the more detailed stuff about game-based learning, could you maybe just, for the listeners and for us, to be honest, who don't have much experience or don't know much about learning and teaching, maybe just give a couple of examples, very simple examples of how a teacher might integrate games into their teaching. For example, like a teacher who's thinking,
Sure.
I want to use games. What's the first thing I can do?
So one of the first language games that I was exposed to was this game, Two Truths and a Lie. Do you know that game?
Yes.
Okay, right. So I'm going to say 3 sentences, and
you don't have to actually do.
Yeah, no, right. But so you know the game, right? So if a teacher is focused on the present perfect and has been teaching some grammar and going through some exercises, that teacher might use that game as a warm-up to illustrate the language point, or use it as some sort of production activity to make sure that the students have learned the point and are able to use it,
practice it,
right? That's one example, right? So this sort of CLT game.
Okay. Yep.
Wow,
great.
That's not the answer I was expecting. But
What, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really nice example, because I think maybe that sort of opens our eyes to the fact that maybe there are probably very few teachers who haven't used some kind of game in their language teaching.
True. Yeah, this is true.
Yep. And then maybe, I guess the next question would be, from the perspective of people who have looked into this deeply, what would be the advantage of structuring a present perfect activity in that sort of way versus just write 3 present perfect sentences for me?
Well, I think the argument that is used for including such activities in, do I say, low-level ELT teaching, the argument for using that kind of thing is it's engaging. It's something fun for the students to do. Not that whether that's you can decide for yourself whether that's a good argument or not, but I think that's what you'd find in the literature for such games.
That there's interaction, right? That the students are talking to each other. They're outputting.
Yeah.
It
forces output.
Output. If their partner has a question, there's an opportunity for feedback. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I don't understand that word.
From an interactionist approach.
Exactly, right? Where if they're writing those down, there's less of an opportunity for immediate feedback unless the teacher is walking around the class and looking at those sentences and offering each student immediate feedback on those sentences.
And also from a CLT's perspective, that's not speaking. So
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay, but then maybe even just say 3 things that you've done in your life to your partner. Your partner asks you questions. That's maybe not necessarily gamifying that sort of activity, but the 2 lies or 2 truths and a lie does. Does that make sense?
You just said the magic word, right? This idea of gamification and gamify, because I think that's something that we would love to try to dive into a little bit with you, and I'm not sure how to do it, but we do see a difference. There are some people who do see a difference and don't see a difference between game-based learning and teaching and gamification. And those are really fuzzy and they overlap and people use them interchangeably. James has talked a lot about games and gamification. One way to talk about those would be to gamify a class might be to include points and leaderboards and badges and to incentivize certain behaviors, right? Like think about your Starbucks point card, right? You go to Starbucks, you buy a latte, you get some points. Similarly, you go to a language classroom, you use the present perfect correctly, and you get some credit.
Participation
points, output points. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, so we tend to look at gamification in that light, like adding game elements to
non-game environments.
Exactly, the gamification to gamify a class.
I think that's the general.
That's the general. When we talk about game-based language teaching, we're talking about using games.
I see.
We can wax philosophical about what is a game. Life is a game. We're playing a game right now. I wrote a paper in grad school about diets are games, right? There are points and there are rules and there's outputs and there's goals and all this kind of stuff. So we do more of the sort of the game-based language teaching. Like we'll bring in Two Truths and a Lie. We'll bring in Monopoly. We'll bring in Tic-Tac-Toe. We'll bring in Minecraft. We'll use those products, tools, media, artifacts.
Yeah, so I think not that Matthew's putting his foot in it, but he's exemplifying the misconception between these terms gamification and game-based learning, which is, it's not your fault. It's actually rife through the whole field, not even within language teaching, even outside of language teaching, in general education educational fields, the idea of, well, gamification is using games, isn't it? Well, no, actually the terms are split a little bit, where gamification is this kind of fake behavioralistic approach to giving rewards for certain activities.
Or punishments.
Disguised as rewards. Yeah. So yeah, the idea of like using a game versus applying game mechanics to something. So yeah.
We give grades in our classes. That's a game, right?
Right. Yep.
Okay.
Okay. No, I think that's sort of cleared up a little bit for me, that the distinction between the two. And then in terms of the advantages of, I mean, it sounds like that you guys are more on the side of game-based language teaching, right, versus just gamifying.
We have experience with gamification. Like we've played around with it in our classes. I wrote a paper in
gamification, and I was gung-ho about it back when it was super hype, but just didn't have any success with it really. And it's very shallow, the majority of things you see on gamification. So yeah, I try to steer away from that and advise other people not to get involved with gamification.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in terms of the difference for the effect it has on students, maybe just focusing on game-based language teaching and learning. So what are you talked a little bit before about engagement, and then in terms of the gamification, incentivizing students to do something. What do you see as the key advantages for students for game-based learning and teaching?
This is a really tricky question.
Yeah, I agree.
So if we can think about game-based language teaching in relation to a term that everybody knows, TBLT, task-based language teaching. Okay, so TBLT has frameworks built in. It's like this, you can imagine the Willis framework, where you've got the pre-task, task, post-task cycle. It's a very structured, it's a very well-established approach to teaching, right? I think we both agree that TBLT has a specific way of teaching with tasks, right? So GBLT, it's not the same. It's not a framework that you can just apply to your teaching practices in the way that you can TBLT. Game-based language teaching just refers to the use of games as part of your teaching. So you can do a TBLT-focused game-based language teaching. You can do a multi-literacies game-based language teaching. You can do PPP game-based language teaching. So game-based language teaching is kind of this amorphous blob of good teaching with games. So the advantages of teaching with games means, well, what are the advantages of those pedagogies that you're actually supporting it with? It's not the game itself. It's how is that being integrated into a wider pedagogy? So it's a really difficult question to answer, actually.
It's almost like you're asking, like, what are the benefits of textbook? What are the affordances of CLT? Right? It's getting those theoretical frameworks definitely cross over, right? Output is good, interaction is good, comprehensible input is good.
Yeah, but if you're asking the question, what affordances do games offer, then of course the most obvious one is interaction between students.
Sure.
It depends on the game though, again, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we could talk about we could talk about listening games. So we could talk about a TPR game. We could talk about a speaking game. We could talk about
a hidden role board game.
Exactly.
We could talk about
MMOs, World of Warcraft.
So
no, it sounds like the question is, maybe, I guess another way you could refute my question is just to say that I'm asking what is good about games in general. Like, why does anybody play a game, regardless of whether or not it's involved with language teaching and learning?
Right.
But I think people can point to advantages and disadvantages to, TBLT and CLT and all those kinds of things.
For sure, yeah.
And the inclusion of games, inclusion or exclusion of games, maybe wouldn't affect those advantages or disadvantages. It sounds to me basically adding games to those things doesn't take away or detract from those things, but it's just putting something on top of those. It's a medium for.
It's an interesting one. I think if we stick with TEFL, which is what I'm more familiar with, you can almost argue that a task itself is a game. It's an information gap. If you imagine the game Mafia or Werewolf, this is a typical information gap activity. So meaningful language use is promoted as one of the tenets of task-based language teaching, and meaningful language use you get during a game because you're goal-directed. You're trying to use language to solve a puzzle or a problem, which is not per se using language for language's sake, which is again something that's promoted in TBLT. So this is where I see games and TBLT quite coalescing quite nicely. You have a pre-task where you learn how to play the game. Then you do the task itself where you play the game. You have a post-task where you look at maybe things that places where you were misunderstood, which made you fail the game, for example. So I think they coalesce quite nicely there.
Continuing on the question that you just asked, and this is a sort of a different take of what James just said. So what would make a game good for learning, or why do people play games? Are you familiar with the game Plague Inc?
Nope.
It's a smartphone game. And you take the role of a virus, right? So this is very topical, right? So you play as a virus, and you can. The goal of the game is for you to spread all over the world and kill everyone, and you do that by mutating, by traveling around the world on airplanes and boats, by hiding symptoms, by prolonging an incubation period, and it's. The mechanics teach you what it's like to be a virus, and it teaches you how viruses spread. And so what Plague Inc. is a simulation, or it's a system of different mechanics and concepts and ideas. And to me, that's what a game is. Like it's a way for you to experience something else, right? Whether that's a historical simulation, whether that's a lying simulation like Two Truths and a Lie. Plague Inc. gives you the experience of being a virus, and it teaches you all of these really interesting and important and right now critical ideas about viruses. And so it's a system, right? It's a representation of reality. There are so many games out there that represent some aspect of society. That's largely how I use games. In addition to Plague Inc., it also has a group of players around the game who are also talking about the game. So you can go on Twitter and you can talk about Plague Inc. and you can talk about strategies for beating the game. So you've not only got language in the game and you've got ideas that you're exploring in the game by playing it, but you've also got a community around the game that you can use language in and around, right?
Yeah, about the idea of it being a simulation.
Yeah.
So from the language teaching perspective,
right,
a game gets rid of the chaff and just boils down that particular system, or that, for example, if you're teaching, if you want them to talk about the past or a particular grammar point, you could perhaps imagine that you create a specific game or specific role play,
that's right,
which represents that in a simple base form. So
I have taught, and I still do teach ESP sometimes, and role plays and simulations are just my bread and butter, right? Like I'm running a simulation right now of an NPO that's tackling the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's a large scale year-long role play of students joining and working as part of this NPO. To me, that's a game,
which is framed from this is like Rakuten, where
they have to speak English, and we've got a Slack group, and we've got email, and
you've got NPCs.
That's right. It's a sim, it's a system. There's a group around it that students can talk to.
It's a boiled down single point.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. There's lots of texts in the game, like all the instructions are in English or the target language, right?
And they represent a lot of what CLT or TBLT leaning approaches are asking for in terms of tasks and that kind of thing. So
that's right.
They fit in nicely.
Yep. So you've got this system, and the students have played this game, Plague Inc. Then you can also discuss it, right, in the class. You can say, like,
it's a shared experience.
Exactly. And like, how realistic is this to what we're experiencing right now with COVID-19? Like, what are the tendencies of that? And you can discuss it, you can debrief it, and you can apply it to other contexts.
It sounds to me a little bit like the game-based language teaching is a form or an alternative to like a content, like a CLIL approach.
Again, so this does actually come back to my original point about you could do GBLT CLIL, you could do TBLT based, game-based teaching. You could do PPP based game-based teaching. You could do EAP-based game-based teaching. You could do ESP. You know, anything can really be under the umbrella of using games. So,
Okay.
yeah.
I guess I would argue that maybe a CLIL approach could also be applied to all those different things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, what I'm doing is much closer to a CLIL approach than James's context is.
Yeah, interaction. Yeah.
Okay.
Can we ask you a question, by the way? Can I just segue? So
Yep.
we are finding more and more that we are heavily invested in games. We know the field, if we can call it that, about games and language teaching. We know from MMOs to these two truths and a lie games. What have your experiences been with using games? And, just to help us out to know where you are in that regard, like what kind of classes do you teach? Do games play any part? It's just really nice for us to know about other teachers' experience.
I think maybe, I've certainly done two truths and a lie. For a review class, I've made my own board games.
Okay. Would that be, for example, roll and move, and when you land on a space, say what's on there or answer the question kind of thing?
Yeah, could be
Right.
that sort of thing. But
Okay.
obviously, I don't recall earlier in my career what sort of things I did. I imagine probably I did what I've seen in my role as a manager, seen other teachers do it and try to discourage, which is games that don't take into account the pedagogical side of things.
Excellent. That's really nice to hear. I've just got a slight related question to that. So where do you see games fitting into a course or in teaching in general? Because you mentioned there that you discourage the kind of for us, we'd call it a Friday afternoon treat would be, the use of a game, which is very vapid, really.
And we agree.
And we have, I don't know if you've looked at both of our models, but games really do make up the core. And then there's a huge pedagogy and classes around it that, you would maybe play one game over 7 weeks with many, many activities. We don't just throw away a game on Friday afternoon. So, yeah, it's just interesting it's actually very positive to hear that you said that you don't like games to be used in a frivolous way like that. So.
Yeah. I don't know. Is your position that it's beneficial for all teachers to at least introduce some elements of games to their courses, or is it just purely if that's what you're interested in, do it. If not, then don't?
Okay, I think there's two answers to this. The first one is I'm actually quite happy to say take your passion and use that to teach with. So if you are a movies buff and you can reach those same course goals through the use of movies and sound pedagogy, then fine. I'm quite happy to say that. Yeah, go with where your gut is and your passion is and what you know, which is why, I use games and that's what I'm into. So the second one that might touch on is, well, games do have solid affordances for language learning. And so to deny those, for example, you can only watch a movie. You can watch a game and interact within the game. So there's just a little bit more potential with a game, perhaps. Maybe that's just my perception. And one of the arguments that we're reading at the moment about the use of games in language teaching is there's often a popularity bent, if you like, to say that, well, games are played by 95% of children, therefore you should be using games. Well, you could say that, but another way that's slightly more sound is to say that, well, if children do know games or students know games, and then to deny them what they know as a teaching tool is perhaps not very good, because the teacher doesn't know their culture or what they do in their free time, you're kind of denying them that part of themselves. So there's a couple of arguments for why games should be used. Jonathan, do you have anything to add to that?
I think teachers should teach better. No, I think that teachers should carefully consider the contexts, carefully consider the goals, who their students are, and whatever pedagogy and tools they can use to meet those goals, I think they should use those. There are probably many cases where many of those elements are not being integrated or considered to an extent that I think would help more students. So you on your podcast, you talk to a lot of CLT teachers, right? To teachers who are proponents of either or both, like a strong form of CLT and a weak form of CLT, right? Where if you've got the strong form of CLT, then you're really looking at texts and you're looking at meaning making. and you're contextualizing it in society, and you're looking at language as a system of communication for purposes bigger than the classroom. And then you've got, on the other hand, you've got sort of the weak version of CLT, where the spoken output is the be all and end all, where if students are producing the target language in the classroom, that's a win for both the teacher, the student, and the institution, right? No matter whatever students are producing. Okay, so in the weak form of CLT, games are great because it gets students outputting the target language form. You get the 95% student talk time. You get them practicing the grammar and the vocabulary and all the skills that are outlined in these textbooks that are being foisted on students all over the country and all over the world. And so games can probably be a big part of that weak side of CLT. Google 100 great ESL games and you'll find your curriculum.
So where do games fit into the strong form of CLT for you, Jonathan? Are they a need based on the teacher's passion?
I think that games are one of the highest forms of human communication. I think that if you look at sort of like the game studies work that's coming out, like the types of interactions, the types of societies, the types of play that's happening in meaning making in modern MMOs, in modern board games, in games,
indie
game scene, in games that parents play with their kids. I think like play, I mean, what was it? Albert Einstein said like play is the highest form of research, right?
Okay.
It's this idea that play is complex, play is human. And so if you really just want to explore play and meaning making and human interaction, there's no reason why games and play and role plays shouldn't be at the core of a language class. Like if I'm teaching an ESP class, there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to structure it as a long-term role play and have like debriefings and strategic interactions.
The thing is, you might find teachers actually doing that, but they don't consider what they're doing a game. It's just more.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So it's simulation based, or it's role play. It's
definition of
exactly.
James
is kicking me under the table, by the way.
In our
it hurts.
last episode, I guess Matt, Rob, and I talked about what we understood about games in preparation for this interview.
Yeah.
And I understand you've listened to that episode.
We have.
Yes, we have.
Okay. It was great.
And any comments, any things that jumped out at you?
I loved your comment about some teachers using game-based teaching because they're gamers, right? And I loved your comment that that's a lot of call. You know, that sort of gets into the sort of the call syndrome as well.
Yeah, where was that? They did.
They talked about it, right? Like, so if somebody's into making podcasts or somebody's into making iMovies, they're going to bring that into the classroom. And I think that there is there's definitely a not minor proportion of the people doing game-based language teaching who get into it because they're interested in the technology. It's not a carefully balanced, what are the affordances for textbooks versus games, and I'm going to choose games. It's I have a PlayStation at home, I love it, let's see if this works.
There's a question about the entry points to learning about game-based language teaching as well. I think it was we started the journal hopefully to bridge a gap between the research side of game-based language learning and then what practitioners are doing, like teachers themselves. So we do see a gap in game-based approaches where, for example, like the call journals, Recall or Call Journal and Calico, a lot of the papers in there are very short-term lab-based studies, which really don't have a lot of practical application. If we look at the very, very far technical side of games, like the massive online role-playing games, they're really not applicable to general language teachers' contexts. So hopefully, if you are interested in some entry points on how to teach with games, then the journal that we started is a good point to look at actual teaching with games. I
liked your comment as well about the need to balance teaching and technology. And I think that's it, right? Like that, if there's anything that we can, encourage a conversation about, or as you as well, is just how to integrate technology seamlessly into the classroom. Just to choose the best tools for the job, to choose the best pedagogy to meet the goals, and that's true of what we're trying to do with GBLT, and that's true, hopefully, of call and other things as well. To normalize things and to stress the teaching and the pedagogy over the technologies.
Yeah, pedagogy first, definitely. With technology, people conceive it as a kind of silver bullet or a magic bullet that they can just throw it in, and that's all that needs to be done for learning to happen. We're very much on the other side of the coin where, for example, if I'm going to play a game with students, we're going to, I mean, this might be revolutionary for some teachers, but we're going to play it 2 or 3 weeks in a row, actually. We're not just going to use it Friday afternoon. So it's the idea of tech for tech's sake, or tech as the way to learn. No, it's just one tool that actually does need solid teaching behind it. And so if there's anything that we want listeners to take away from this, is that, yeah, games for us are not a magic bullet. They're not where the learning actually happens. It's around the gaming, and so that's just one point I'd like to make.
Right.
So
The teaching is the magic bullet,
absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
Rather than the Jolt call fetishists that perhaps are using the latest app.
Right.
Okay. And maybe just to finish, I'd like to give you the chance to maybe talk about some of the projects that you're working on in terms of using games in the classroom that, we talked about what's the entry point. Obviously, you guys entered a long time ago, and you've developed things over time, and you're probably doing some pretty amazing things using games in your courses. So would you mind just giving us a couple of examples?
The way that I'm using games in the classroom, it is probably more familiar to your audience, in that I come from a traditional CLT, TBLT approach, where the only goal of my class was really to get the students speaking. So anyway, I'm using games as part of a TBLT approach where, like I mentioned earlier, the task itself is the gameplay, where they're outputting the language as they're playing the game. It's meaning focused. They're working towards a goal that's not based on using the language, but in achieving that goal. So it fits in nicely with the TBLT approach. Now, I use board games, which you may know are things like Monopoly and the Game of Life are the traditional ones, but there's many interesting board games that have come out recently. And so the way that I'm using these as part of a TBLT approach is that the way that you play a board game is you have to read the rule book before you play. So you have this opportunity to get reading skills and productive skills. Sorry. So you establish these skills before you play the game, and this will be a full class. So I don't read the rule book, play the game, and do post task within one class. Is the pre-task is a class unto itself. The playing the game is a class unto itself. And I'm working at a university, so I've put 100 minutes aside for this one class for them to learn how to read the rule book. So, and then if they can't figure out how to play the game, then they've obviously not understood the rules. So there's this way of getting feedback on their reading and their ability to actually understand. So you've got the pre-task, read the rule book, the task, play the game, and we transcribe the gameplay. So they're all using their smartphones to record the gameplay. They'll transcribe it for homework. And then the third class will be a look at their shared transcriptions to find any errors in their speech. We'll watch a YouTube video of native speakers playing the game so that they can mine it for some interesting vocabulary that they might want to use. Then the fourth class will be them replaying the game, hopefully with improved linguistic abilities. And this class also is a test. So I will go around to each group and I will mark I've got a small rubric, and I'll mark their ability on their second playthrough. So they've got a chance to prove that they've able to output the language, essentially. And then the fifth class will be a reflection on that. They will take the 2 transcriptions that they've made, analyze any differences, see if they've improved, and think about if they have proved or if they've not. And then finally, they'll do a group presentation where they share their opinion of the game to other groups in the class, because everyone's playing, all groups are playing different games. So this is very, very TBLT, and pre-task, task, task repetition, and then a report at the end based on their play. So that's how I'm using games in my particular context.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Have you written up that?
Yep, that's on LLP, the journal we just started, and I've got a couple of papers elsewhere on that framework as well.
Okay, thanks a lot, James.
Yeah.
How about you, Jonathan?
Yeah, so I'm in the sort of the strong CLT camp, and I'm using the pedagogy of multiliteracies from like the New London Group and Cope and Calansis's frameworks, where I'm really interested in the student, and I'm interested in sort of this idea of agency and transformation. And I use that pedagogy to help students transform themselves and also to transform society. So we're looking very much inside the classroom and outside the classroom. And so I use this pedagogy where we spend some time talking about who we are and who we want to be. And then based on those goals, I'll help them choose games or simulations or role plays or systems to look at, or other texts, right? Even YouTube videos. And so we'll play a game, and we'll spend a lot of time playing the game, collecting data, and then, of course, discussing the game a lot. There's a really lengthy debriefing that we go through, like several hours, talking about the game and the language and the education and the game and its connection to society.
And how it relates to their goals.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
all the time. And after we discuss it, the students will start to point themselves towards those participatory projects, like how they want to change and how they want to change society. And they'll do analysis projects to prepare themselves for that. And so a couple examples over the past couple of years is one student who played a board game, and then in the discussion we came upon just some interesting concepts from game studies, and she got interested in how people write about games online, right, on Amazon or Board Game Geek or Twitter. And so she did a discourse analysis, right, like a textual analysis, like a literacy analysis of like 40 to 50 different texts, and looking at how people are using language to communicate about games online. And she took that analysis and she posted a really nice review on a gaming website.
So she synthesized those reviews.
Oh, absolutely. Synthesized, appropriated,
for her own
transformed,
purposes,
exactly, right? And so she was using all these different, linguistic tools. Another girl that just graduated from my seminar was played some games, and in the discussion she became very interested.
What kind of games did she play though?
Like we played a lot of German board games, children's games,
Right.
And she became very interested in just how children play games. And I introduced her to our local children's hospital, and she became very enamored with the idea of helping those kids. Right? She researched how people do charity work and how charities are organized, and she organized a public charity event around games to raise money to buy games and toys to donate to a children's hospital.
Wow.
Based on playing a bunch of games and having a discussion.
Yeah.
So it's literally transforming students in society. Like that is the goal. If I'm not aiming towards that with my pedagogy, I'm not on the right track. And so my students are remixing games and selling games and conducting interviews with game designers. And that's all around the pedagogy of multiliteracies, right? This very lockstep. Play a game, have a discussion, do analysis projects, participate in society as a bridge to your future self.
Great. Okay. Well, I think that's a fantastic place to end. Would you like to just plug your website and your journal?
Yep. So we started a journal, like I mentioned, to try and, the mission of the journal is to promote actual teaching with games. We've discovered a gap in terms of a lot of teachers using games where the students learn through the gameplay. But we're much more interested in how teachers are using games in their own practices. So everything that comes out in the journal will have been used in a real classroom, and that's the approach that we're going for. So if you, listener, have used games in your teaching and you have some data, or you have you'd like to tell the world about how you've used games or play, it doesn't have to be a game, then please get in touch with us. The website is www.llpjournal.org. LLP Journal.
That's great. Okay, James and Jonathan, thank you very much for talking with us.
Pleasure. Thank you again.
It was a lot of fun.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you again to James and Jonathan for agreeing to take part in the interview, and special thanks to James for his 8-bit rendition of the TEFLology theme music. For more information about James and Jonathan, please check the show notes for this episode on the TEFLology website. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can send an email to teflology@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter @TEFLology. You can also like our Facebook page, and if you're so inclined, please write a review on iTunes. We'll be back with a regular episode soon.